I'm real excited about this talk because it's going to be more than just this. This is what I said I talk about, and I am. Back in 2007, I was at a client where there were good scrum teams, but they couldn't coordinate well. It wasn't that big of a problem. And I used, well, at the time, I'm not even sure I knew I was using all of flow and theory of constraints. I was mostly into lean at that time. But when I look at it, I was using theories from all three to provide two options that I'm going to go over, and realized later that a multi-team solution was created. I thought of it as a special case because I do that a lot. I make up practices all the time based on theory, and that's part of the message. But this talk is more blast as an example of what approach we should take. So do we take a minimalistic approach based on values and principles of its creator? Yeah, I'm talking about Scrum. Do we make a collection of practices like SAFe approaches? Or do we come from a combination of first principles and practices within a well-defined context so we can see what we need to do for our situation while not having to reinvent the wheel? People seem to ignore this third option as possible. It's like, well, you got to do that framework, you got to do this framework, you've got to reinvent everything. And that's just not true. There are other approaches that are very well defined. Mine's not alone. That's what I'm going to talk about. I saw Steve Tenzin's on here with Tame Flow. I highly recommend his work and his book. There are lots of things out there that are not frameworks that, in my mind, get around the challenges frameworks have inherently. So the other thing I realized, and perhaps this won't be shown in this talk, but sometimes it's not just are you effective or not, it's can you align around things. I have this thing I call the Amplio Community of Practice, and one of the exercises we did in it was to look at the challenges people had. And part of my idea is I was going to show them how to overcome the challenges. And I have to admit, when I looked at what people had, about half of them didn't fit my normal way of doing things. You know, it wasn't like people were violating a principle and all I have to do is show them, hey, do this instead. What it was people weren't aligned. There was no common ground between managers and developers and things. So I think this alignment issue is very important. And actually, I'm going to talk about how this approach helps alignment as well. Okay, so here's the issue. So I was at a client. They had about, if I recollect, about 150. It wasn't that big, but this was back in 2007. And they told me that they were doing all these things. And to be candid, I normally don't believe it when a client tells me they're doing all these things right. I'm nice. I don't tell them I don't believe you. But in this case, I actually did believe them. And the reason I believe them is because Jeff Sutherland, one of the co-creators of Scrum, had trained them, and their development manager was about to become certified as a CST, certified Scrum trainer. So they had the smarts there, but what they had was some difficulty. And they had this organization structure like this. They had a product line. They had multiple product lines, product line A and B, and each product line had its own component team, and they had system-wide component team. And this seemed kind of reasonable as a structure. I mean, obviously you would prefer to have cross-functional teams, but they felt that they needed this specialization, and I wasn't judging it at the time. Again, this was back in 2007, so I didn't have the experience I have now on what we call the value creation structure. But what they were concerned about was if you take this, like where I've got it, whatever that color is, I guess peach and gray, and then a light green, they had like a whole product line team, and then some of the component team for that product line, and then a smaller amount for the system-wide working together on a product. So there were three teams, one full team, and then parts of two other teams building an application. This was the scenario. And the problem, as they described it to me, is they were working on small items of value. Okay. This is what we call minimum business increments. This is when you have an existing product and you take the smallest releasable addition of functionality or value you want. This is as opposed to a minimum viable product where you're creating a new product and you're more in discovery. See, MVPs are more about investing in discovering if you have a product and are done very small, typically one or two teams will do that. But in MBI, minimum business increment, or in TameFlow, they call it a move. It's the idea that this is the smallest releasable chunk of value that's worth delivering based on also the value and the transaction cost for the customer and the business. And they said they were doing this, which at that time, very few people were doing it, but I believe them because they had very competent people. Each team was doing Scrum well. Again, not very common, but they had Jeff in there and they had a CST virtually there as well. And by the definition of doing it well, I was just saying, well, did they get what they were predicting? So it sounded like they had a decent way of figuring their value, and they were, in fact, building it as they suggested, but they couldn't get value at the door quickly. And I can remember talking about this where I was like, what's going on here? They're doing all the pieces. I was looking at this piece and this piece and this piece and this piece, and everything added up to being wonderful, yet it wasn't working. So it was like, okay, what's going on? So I remember the next day, so we chatted about a day, and I remember the next day I said, look, I still don't get a clear idea of what's going on. So let's do a little bit of value stream mapping. And we didn't do like real value stream map, but we looked at step. So here's what was going on. They took this thing, they weren't calling it an MBI, but this functionality, small chunk of functionality, working on small items. This was releasable. Okay. This was like if they built this. And what they did is they split it up into the 3 teams, which made sense. So I have the application team on the top, I have the component team for that application, and I have the component team for the whole organization, and they split it up, and then they gave the 3 teams their part of it. So when all of this is done, and they figured it was about 3 sprints. They were doing 2-week sprints. Again, a good thing, unheard of at that time for many people, but they were doing it well. And the rationale was people get to self-organize. You've heard this before, probably. So each team had their own sprint backlogs. And what happened, of course, is the teams now decided to work on these by what worked for them. So what you had was one team pulled something and other teams pulled something that was best for them. But there wasn't this coordination. Like if you notice, each of the teams, like I had them in order kind of what might be functional, but by pulling in an uncoordinated way, although they were able to get this stuff done, they couldn't integrate. So as we walked through the steps, we found, oh, your problem is integration, that we can't get that done. So I marked that progress bar with red because it was like, yeah, I built it, but it's not integrated. And what we have, so the slide's not advancing. Here we go. So they couldn't integrate it. And this is the bottleneck. So it was clear this integration issue was what was slowing down. So just general knowledge of theory of constraints, you look for the constraint. That was the big issue. And the issue here was also that we had delays in what we were building. So we couldn't get feedback. And if you've ever done software development, if you build something and integrate it immediately, it's faster than if you integrate it like in several weeks because you don't remember it. Also be clear, this was 2007. So although Kanban may have existed and a lot of flow may have existed, I wasn't aware of it. I was still in this iterative incremental approach that Scrum did. Okay, so I'm not thinking about doing this in a flow model at this stage. Maybe I should have, but I didn't know it, so I didn't. There's another piece here. I was violating a first principle of optimizing the whole. In other words, remember, maybe that arrow ought to be pointing to here. Remember that what they did is we gave each team their sprint backlog, and then the team picked what was best for the team. We didn't pick what's best for throughput of value. So I noticed all these. I noticed, well, we got a bottleneck. This is causing waste. We're not looking at the whole. Okay, so this was a problem. And I knew this was an issue. So what happened is, of course, they did this again, another 2 weeks, they did it again, but we still couldn't integrate because it didn't line up the functionality. We were pulling things out. So the delay of integration increases something I call accumulated risk. Okay, and what accumulated risk is, I pulled this comes from one of my books that I'm writing, I'll refer to at the end. Accumulated risk is the term we use for risk for unfinished items. And it's something that people don't talk a lot about in at least in Agile. I haven't heard this too much, but see right here, if I have this releasable chunk of work and I have a feature, see if I build 2 stories out of this feature, but it's not done, well, I've lowered the risk of these stories, but I haven't lowered the risk that I build the features right, because I haven't completed them. I can't get feedback on them. Whereas if I focus, and I'm trying to illustrate maybe about the same amount of work, I can now get feedback on this, get feedback on this. I have less risk on the right because I at least know this feature is done right. I still don't have the risk of the MBI done because I haven't finished it. Okay. So when we want to finish things, we've heard the phrase, stop starting, start finishing. The question is, that's not just stories. That's, have I finished my stories? Have I finished my features? Have I finished my MBIs? And this set of eyes is not very common in the Agile space. It would be if you're using Lean, it would be if you're using Flow, it would be if you're using theory of constraints, because there's no value created until the whole thing's done. But this is an important point that's often not quite looked at. Okay. Okay, I'm going to just continue on. But I'm trying to point out that they were violating a lot of principles in the way they were working. So the fact that they were having troubles was not a surprise to me. Oh, now I know what's going on. They're locally doing great, but they're not looking at the bigger picture. They're not looking at how they coordinate. So at the end of the 6 weeks, 3 sprints where they've done all this, they have to reintegrate everything. Now integration takes a long time. This is why they couldn't release. And of course, they had commitments because they planned this to be done in 6 weeks, and now they're starting something else or supposed to start something else, and they can't get it done. So this was not a great thing. Now, this is good that they can integrate, but this extra work here is extra work. This is what I call induced work, or it's waste. And in knowledge work, especially IT and software, there's a lot of mantra, eliminate waste and all that, but there's a problem with that mantra. I've never quite liked the eliminate waste mantra, because you can't see waste in knowledge work the way you can see waste in a manufacturing environment. A bad bumper on a car falls off, you can see it. I've done intense studies. Let me show you. This is how developers who are writing bug-free great code look. Okay, watch carefully. Okay, now I'm going to show you what happens when they write bugs. Do you see the difference? There isn't any difference. That's a joke. The point is, you cannot see errors by watching the activity the way you can in a physical environment, in a software development and even product work where you're designing something. That's why I use prototypes in physical design of products. And that's why you do tests and feedback in the virtual world. So you've got to be careful. So what we can see are delays, like we saw the delays in the integration step. We can see that. And what we need to know, and this is now another principle, delays cause waste. You probably heard the phrase just in time from Lean. That's where this comes from, or maybe it comes from somewhere else, but that's where I learned it anyway. Okay. So consider this. People talk about, I've said this for decades, if it's clear if we can't see it, we can't manage it. But I'm going to suggest if we can't see it, we also can't consider it. In other words, what should we be doing? Well, if you don't see it, you can't consider it. This is a great quote from Edgar Schein, which seems to be ignored by many in the community. We do not think and talk about what we see. We see what we are able to think and talk about. So if we're not thinking and talking about things, we don't see them. There's this kind of joke, this guy's looking for his keys under the lamppost, and so yeah, I dropped them over there, but the light's better. So when we have a framework, one of the problems with a framework is we look at the framework. We don't look outside the framework. And there's all these things we don't see. And because we don't see them, we don't even consider them, and we don't even talk about them. And that's why we don't see them. So this is a serious problem with most frameworks, is we do not see what we need to see. And, I love Peter Senge's thing, today's problem comes from yesterday's solution. So I'm not saying Scrum is bad. I'm not saying Scrum didn't make a difference in the industry. I think it made a huge positive difference in the industry for a while. But I think now when we just look at it, there's a problem with just looking at it. And I love this from Arthur Schopenhauer. And this creates a loop of understanding, I think. The task is not so much to see what no one has seen yet, but to think what nobody has thought yet about what everybody sees. Because when you think about it in a different way, you see it differently and you can do something different. And this is really the key here, what we need to do. Okay, so what we want is, instead of intentionally incomplete, everybody says, oh yeah, Scrum's intentionally incomplete. I'm like, okay, We want it to be intelligently incomplete. Just because you do something intentionally doesn't mean it's a good thing. And also, instead of a collection of components, talking about safe here, we want a system. We need to take a system approach. Okay. There's another piece to this, and this is Deming. I'm a big Deming fan. Yes, Deming was in manufacturing, but a lot of things he says is very true. So experience teaches nothing. In fact, there is no experience to record without theory. Without theory, there's no learning, and that is the downfall. People copy examples, and then they wonder what's the trouble. They look at examples, and without theory, they don't learn anything. So I want to give you a little bit guide of what theory I was using here, and then we're going to go on for the solution. So from, first of all, my goal is
question,
what?
If I may interject, I have a quick question. Would you mind to respond to some of the questions, or you'd rather have all the questions parking lots?
Well, if the questions are about something I've said, I would happy to respond to them, but otherwise I'd rather wait to the end, because I always get asked questions about something I'm about to talk about, and it's a very tight talk.
Sure. So let's parking lot all the question. Thank you, Don. Don Miller had a question, and let's parking lot that for the last minutes. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Thank you, Al. Sorry.
Yeah, I'm trying to get through, so I have 10 to 15 minutes of Q&A at the end. I definitely am going to do that. And I'm going to cover some slides lightly as well, because some of them I put here for reference. So just know that as well. And then at the end, we can do more questions. So I want to be clear, what I'm trying to achieve is this business agility, quick realization of value, predictably, sustainably, and with high quality. And I don't mean exact estimation or things like that with the predictability, but you should have some sense of what your value is. Flow gives value across the value stream. Lean tells us to not optimize locally, avoid delays. There's a lot more to Lean. Actually, Lean is more about education than anything else. But this is what I was using here. And theory constraints is a lot more than looking for the constraint. But I'm just going to mention that these three work together. Okay. So I remember what I did. I went to the whiteboard. I literally showed them this slide. Okay, this is an old slide. We built it in 2005 or 2006 at Net Objectives. And we talk about a discovery and a delivery part. There's an input. And don't worry about it. It looks a little waterfall, but we had feedback in it. The point is, we do a certain amount of stuff that we get stuff ready to pull. Then we get ready in a short time to do it, some iterative development, incremental deployment, support, and feedback, and we're all good. But what was being ignored was this part right here. The iterative development is really one thing. They just happen to have it be split up across three teams. So what we wanted to do was use a shared backlog, because that's really the value stream. We wanted to think of it as a whole. And therefore, we needed an integration train type thing that we would do it. Now, again, this is not what I would have come up with today, but 2007. This is where we were at 2007. Okay. So what we can do, this is just a side observation. I hear people talk about running experiments in Agile. And my experience is, if you don't have a solid theory, all you can do is run experiments. But it's a slow, light way to learn. I've never liked the phrase, oh, you got to run a lot of experiments. I don't run many experiments, because most of the time, if I'm changing a process or a workflow, I've got a solid theory and I pretty know what's going to happen, because I'm using a proven theory that I have a track record, and I'm using that. But most Agilists don't have that. I'm proposing we do that. Again, this is what Flex provided, what my Amplio now provides. And like Steve has tame flow, theory constraints, and some other things. And there are a lot of few others that are like that. You still have to validate what you do if it's a brand new approach. But it's kind of interesting. I've had more success predicting a new approach when I had a team that wanted to do something following theory than when I'm than when I'm working with people who are not quite motivated. In other words, there's more uncertainty. There is more uncertainty working with people who aren't motivated than there is with motivated people trying to do something new. I've definitely seen this. Okay. So we could do one of two things. We could try to coordinate the work, or we can pull the work at the same time. Okay. So in other words, what we did, or what I suggested, I'm going to explain how this isn't quite what we did, but this was the technique I came up with. That's the forerunner of BLAST. As we split the MBI up into, oh, here's a slice of value. Here's a slice of value. And then what we did is we gave it to the teams, not the whole thing, just, hey, do this slice and then build it. And now they're building it in a coordinated fashion. Notice this lets them also readjust within a 2-week period. So what happened, we kept doing this piecemeal until it was done and we got the MBI. And as our progress bar shows, basically we integrated after every 2 weeks. Now, there are better ways to do this than what we did. Again, this is the precursor to BLAST. But this cut out a lot of waste, okay? And it's very important. And I remember still one of the managers there said, oh, you're just making a bigger team. And this was maybe the insight about that led to BLAST, because now these 3 teams were working together. Notice, yeah, it's more than 8, it's more than a pizza team, but that's the idea. Conceptually, they were one team working. Okay, so that was a key piece. So now we had 2 options. One option was to have shared backlogs. That's what I actually suggested. But I also knew another option would be to reorganize the teams into cross-functional teams. And I didn't suggest that per se, because I knew if they saw why that would be useful and they would know if it was possible, that's what they would do. And in fact, that is what they did. But this technique was still, oh, I got a new trick up my sleeve if I need it. And that was something I used a lot later. In other words, in additional engagements after this, I used this technique of shared backlogs quite a lot. In fact, this wasn't the first time I used the shared engagement. One of our guys had come up with it like a year before that. So the shared backlog was not a surprise or new to me. Okay. So again, they reorganized into cross-functional teams. And it was interesting, about, I don't know, 10 years, 8 years later, I was at the Agile conference, and Jeff Sutherland was presenting a talk on how Agile, rather Scrum, could work multi-user, and it was very effective. And about a third of the way into the talk, I was, well, he's talking about this company. In fact, he then named the company. I'm not going to name him, but he named the company. I said, oh, well, wait a moment, this is weird. Because yes, they were successful, but I want to, what he left out, which I'll admit was a little irritating, was that we used Lean to get there. Okay, I'd been saying this from around this time. This was the year that I'd started talking about saying Scrum could be thought of as a partial implementation of Lean. And if you thought about Scrum that way, you would do Scrum better. And he verified that a few years later in this talk about how they were just doing Scrum great. Just left out the fact that Lean helped them get there. So this is one of my points. Now, I'll tell you what, I'll take a couple of questions now, because this is probably a good time. So let me.
Yeah, I have Don.
Yeah, let me, I can handle it. It'll be faster. Yeah, Don. So the teams have visibility into each other backlogs to see where the MBI work was happening, or was it only discovered at integration? Yes, they saw it, but they weren't doing anything about it. Okay. And in fact, that's a good point. The fact that they saw it, they might have figured out, hey, we should be working together. They were not coordinating, was the point, even though that was available. And this is a key thing. We talk about self-organization, but self-organization is insufficient, because what they weren't doing, and this is one of the problems I have with some of the Agile talking about you know, we're autonomous and we're please put the questions in the chat, because I want to make sure I get questions that are, this is the right time to answer them. The problem is when you organize yourself in a way that is dependent on others, but then you let people work independently because, oh, we're Agile, we get to self-organize. Then what happens is you do things that violate and cause extra work. Okay. So we have to be very careful about this Agile idea of self-organization. Yes, you have to self-organize, but you have to organize in the context of the environment you're in. So once we did this, I should add a couple slides. Sorry, it just occurs to me with this question. They could build this the way they wanted to. This team could build, this team could build this the way they wanted to. This team could build this the way I wanted, et cetera. But they were doing it in the context of working together. And that's very important. So we're not saying self-organization doesn't apply. It certainly applies. But it applies in the context of the whole. And that's ignored a lot of the times. Okay. So let me look in the chat. I think there was another question. Okay, so these kind of questions I'm going to hold on the end. And we'll talk about those at the end. But those are good questions. By the way, the Scrum of Scrums, that's now mostly product owners. We created that at Net Objectives, and then we wrote it up. We called it the Product Coordination Team. And after about 5 years, we started seeing Scrum doing it because we found that coordinating with individual Scrum Masters isn't the very effective way. There's another talk I have where I talk about, or an article I have in my book, where I talk about you want visibility, you want to coordinate, but then you really want alignment. If you have alignment, imagine coordinating cats. Tough job. Get a laser pointer. They're aligned. Do they know what to go after? That's what you want to be doing. Okay. So I'm going to go over this.
I've got a question real quick, Al.
No, I really have to
Okay.
hold the line on the talk because I will not
Okay,
get to the
sure.
end if I take verbal questions. Put it in the chat. Sorry, it's just, this is a very tight talk. I want to introduce this notion of a pattern language. I'm going to go through this very quickly. It's more to get you a taste of it. It's not really needed in BLAST. But we have this dilemma of there's this structure, and we need structure. Frameworks give us structure. This is good. But then they lock us into that structure. That's not so good. So a pattern is well known. It's a solution to a recurring problem in a context. And a pattern's, that's supposed to say a pattern language. I don't know, I missed that slide. So I should say a patterns language is a collection of these where they're working together. An Amplio is a pattern language. It's actually a collection of capabilities that you can do. And in those capabilities, there are different solutions for things. So this provides us in different ways. It's also agnostic. It enables us to apply to existing frameworks. This book's online. I'll have references at the end, and you'll be able to read more about Amplio as a pattern language if you like. But you get the structure, but the patterns give you solutions, but the language can be adapted. So you can add things, you can take things out based on your special, like different technologies have different jargon, things like that. It's kind of useful. Hundreds of patterns already exist. Scrumplop's got, I don't know, well over 100 or something. There are lots of them. And there are other people who've written patterns. So you can pull those in. The pattern language gives you the structure. The individual pieces can be borrowed. Discipline Agile's toolkit can be used as a set of patterns that plug into it. This idea that you have to go between a framework or getting a fit for purpose solution means you have to reinvent something is only because people who are offering frameworks haven't figured out how to break that. This is a new technique. Okay, it's not really new. It's written up and we have training on it. Maybe that's what's new. But the thought process goes back decades. And this is important. The framework the framework is the pattern language just gives you the structure of things. Okay, so I'll answer a couple of questions in the chat before I go to the next slide. So yes, they were siloed. They weren't cross-functional. Duh, that's a mistake. But they didn't see what to do. See, this is the whole issue, that a lot of times people are doing the wrong thing. And this was a smart group. Jeff had been there, CST was there. Now, Jeff hadn't tried coming in at this point where there were problems, but they were looking at how do we get this done, okay? And again, you could coordinate, but coordination is tougher. And I'm thinking there's other ways to do this. Okay, so let me go to this next one. So this is basically a little bit about what Amplio is trying to give you a sense of it. I'm just going to go through this quick because there's really not a lot new here. The idea that you use the customer journey. See, here's something that most people don't even talk about. The customer journey is how the customer interacts with the system. And by adjusting the customer journey, you can change the way the customer's value stream is. Yet we don't often talk about that. Most people are so focused on how do I build the system? How do I build the system to provide value? Instead of how do I have the customer interact with the system that gives them the value stream and operational way of working. Of course, there's a business backlog. This is kind of basic stuff. Okay, so this looks very much like Scrum, and it's intended to be that way. I want to use this diagram as an illustration of something. You have a team here, and you're coordinated. You got a backlog. This should look pretty straightforward. I'm just using this as a base for something when I get to BLAST. Okay. Now there's this issue also. I just want to throw this out as a quick comment because people sometimes react to the pattern language. Oh my God, there's so much stuff you just said. But if you think about it, it only has a few dozen, that's 2 or 3 dozen capabilities. That's at the team level kind of thing. It has an unlimited number of patterns. An intelligent start can be boiled down to a few questions. How do we provide a fit for purpose? These questions are basically, are we doing time boxing or flow? I didn't know flow back then. Are cross-functional teams applicable? See, they're not always applicable. This is kind of the myth that Agile should always be about cross-functional teams. Well, they're good. If you can have them, that's great. But ironically, my first Scrum implementation was in a company where a larger group I wasn't working with couldn't get cross-functional teams. This was in 2001. It wasn't applicable because they needed people to help with things. So regardless of how to start, you must be able to improve. Now I'm going to go through these slides extremely fast. I just want to tell you what the point of them is, because they're not talked about enough in Agile, and they're very important. People talk about inspect and adapt. Okay, well, there are better alternatives. Remember I talked about needing theory? There's this thing Deming talks about: plan, do, study, adjust. Some people call it plan, do, check, act. Some people call it plan, do, study, act. But it's basically this idea of I'll go through it. You plan, you do something, you're adjusting your models as you go. There's what's called the OODA loop, observe, orient, decide, act, made by John Boyd. You should include double loop learning, which is kind of insane to me that we don't. I'll go through each of these super fast. Mostly they're referenced for when you get the slide deck if you want it. So Short and Deming made this. It's like plan, you reset your objectives, you determine what your next actions are going to be. You verify it against your model of understanding. You do the work. You verify, did I get what I expected? You study, should I change my model? So you're continuously cycling through these, but you're always updating your theory of understanding, okay? Again, just for reference, I've got a picture of OODA. I'm not going to talk about it. Personally, OODA is kind of a little better. I don't know, better, wrong word. OODA can have different time frames, and the short loop PDSA typically is done at scheduled times or when you need to do it. I don't think one is inherently better than the other, but I do believe the OODA is easier to get into a quicker flow model of things. It's just here for reference. I do want to mention double loop learning real quickly. And I'm finally going to get the blast in about 2 slides. So single loop learning, this comes from Chris Argyris. Highly recommend you kind of study it. It's really like if you set a thermostat, I want it to be between 70 and 72. The thermostat will look, am I between 70 and 70? Oh, great, I am, or I'm not, I'll change. That's single loop learning. But you want to ask yourself, and this is something that you even can't in some frameworks, because if you change the Scrum framework, you're not doing Scrum anymore. And there's a lot of incentive to stay in the Scrum model because you probably got hired if you're a CSM because you're a certified Scrum Master. So saying, oh, we're not going to do Scrum anymore may not flow. Management said to do Scrum. So there's a lot of psychological stuff here. The idea in double loop learning is you question your means and even your objective of getting there. More than means you get there. Maybe you don't want to stay between 70 and 72. Maybe when you're not home, you want to go something else. Oh, this is where Nest came in. The idea that you could check your devices so you're not at the house. Maybe I change how I do my thermostat. I don't keep it steady throughout the day. This is also programmable thermostat. So in double loop learning, you change your mental model. You look at it, you question it, like maybe I shouldn't do cross-functional teams. Maybe I shouldn't do iterations. Of course, you still have the objectives you have to do. So I'm not saying just change things, drop things out of Scrum or anything like that. But you might want to rethink if there's a better way to do it. Like in the questions. Well, they were silos. They weren't looking together. Yeah, well, maybe you should not have them be silos. Maybe that way of working should change. Okay. So here's what happened. I'll give you a little history. So I did this in 2007. And to be candid, I didn't do anything with it until about 6 months ago. I had some other value creation structures as we talk about it, which is where you look at how teams organize. But I'll admit, one of my prospects was saying, I heard something about, oh, some people are in there looking at Nexus. So I decided to look at Nexus. And I'll tell you why I had never looked at Nexus all these years. because Nexus is an approach of taking teams and combining them together. And I know from Chris Alexander's design approach that is not going to be as effective as looking at the whole and decomposing it as a system, not decomposing it into pieces, but looking at the relationships between things. This is just a better design approach. And what you have is like here, like what they did, the comment about they were siloed, they weren't cross-functional. See, they had said, oh, I need components. Oh, I need the application. I need this. So they decompose it into separate pieces instead of looking at the whole. How would I do the whole working together? When you take the pieces and put them together, you usually get problems. So in my mind, Nexus was always a flawed design. And I don't bother spending much time on things that I know are violating theory. Like if there's an investor that talks about an energy producing machine that violates the laws of thermodynamics, I'll probably be dubious about it. Might read a paragraph on it. And I did out that with Nexus, but not much. I considered it a one-off. I came across Nexus. I realized, well, Al, you've created a lot of one-offs, but people are looking for solutions. Some of those one-offs are really good, and they could become a pattern for the solution we're looking for in a particular context. But it really is just an example of what flow, lean, and theory constraints can do. So I don't think BLAST is this really big thing in a sense, but it solves a problem a lot of people have. And I at least want people to be aware that it's a simple pattern well, maybe it's not that simple, but it's not that complicated, and it works. I've used it a lot of times. I just recently labeled it. And this is the Amplio teams I was talking about. But I want to show you the BLAST picture. It looks very similar. And part of the reason it's very similar, and I didn't realize this until I was talking to Tom Gilb a few weeks ago. By the way, Tom is one of the sharpest people in the industry. You should read anything he's got. He's just really brilliant. Competitive Engineering is a great book, but he's very prolific. Anyway, we talked about it and we said, we realize what we're using are what we called scale-free methods. In other words, eliminating delays across the board or at a team. It's a good thing to do. Now, it may not do you any good if it's not where your constraint is, but but if it is your constraint, how you eliminate them are actually fairly common. So what I came up with was this idea, okay, I'm going to use the customer journey. That's a new thing. Again, everything I'm referring to here is on my website in those books I mentioned that I'll be doing. Okay, have a business value backlog, but now it's across the whole BLAST. It's not just for a team. BLAST planning, you're planning, like you can see, remember we took an MBI. By the way, this is obviously for bigger things and where a team can do it. This is for like where you need 2 to 9 teams or something. I've used this technique. That people have to consider that all of them are focused on this. In the DA workshop, we call this the Focus Solution Team. The idea is I have a group of people here that are working together, but they're working on only one thing, okay? They're working on one thing. So it's a group, but it's more than just a team because we're wanting to speed it along. We have a near-term backlog. This is also, by the way, an iterative, incremental time box solution. You can imagine it's easy to turn it into a flow system if you want to. Just change the implementation of, instead of planning 2 weeks, plan on a flow model, pull the work go. That's a common theme. You have a BLAST creation structure. You've organized it. Now, this is also what's interesting. This is a difference between it and Nexus. See, I might have teams here, but I don't need full teams because I have flow at my hands I could use. So I could have a few people who are like needed by all the teams and they use Kanban or something, or just the flow model or theory constraints, whatever, to coordinate it. So I don't have to just use this rigid approach, but I'm looking at the whole. Notice the coordination now is not these people individually talking to each other. And yeah, maybe I have a scrum of scrums of the product owners, but the coordination is done in the pulling mechanism. I'm looking at what I'm building from a holistic point of view. This is very critical. I could do daily reviews. Actually, I like with this many people, I'd probably have a daily review of at least the Scrum Masters. There are some details that could vary. Continuous review and refinement of the backlog, of course. You're integrating it'd be nice to do CI/CD. See, the key is we're not looking at the individual teams working together. We're looking at the whole and how the pieces relate to each other. It's a mind shift. It's very important. We review This is virtually the same things we had before. Because I'm looking at it from a value stream perspective, I'm not looking at it from a multiple pieces perspective coming up to each other, okay? And again, I mentioned you can have a lot of variations here, okay? So let me give you a couple of references and then I'll go to questions here. I've been writing a book. One thing I realized, I mentioned the employee development book, Effective Lean-Agile Teams. But this is another interesting thing I've been realizing. I realized this months ago when I started this workshop. I have a workshop on this that's over time. It takes like 4 months to go through, but only a couple hours a week. So that's how it's designed. But what I realized, people are always asking me, well, how do I convey this? How do I explain to those people? So I'm writing a parallel book that explains, it's agnostic. It's not about employee. It's just how do you talk to other people to convey ideas? You know, like what's the difference between experts? How do you teach it in little pieces, what to say when people don't get it? This is just those are some of the chapters that are of interest. I'm going to give you a minute to read that. I'm then going to put the reference slide up, read that, and I'm going to go through the questions. We got questions now till the end. I'm going to go through the chat to make sure I get them all, but read that, because to me, this is what we need to do. I think Agile as it's practiced now is a big piano top, and we got to go beyond it. And I'm looking for people who want to work with me on it. This is some of what's available. That's how you get a hold of me. I'm going to give you the PDF. The PDF has links. The Employee Community Practice. You can just go to our website, Success Engineering Works, and find all these. If you like certification, the DA Value Stream Consultant is a certified course through the PMI. We also have a 4-month follow-on to help you with things, improving safe with Lean Agile thinking. If you're doing safe, there's a way to do that. And there are more resources. Okay, so